My name is Andrew Zimmern, and it is my pleasure to moderate what I think is one of the most important panels that you're going to find here at South by Southwest. Officially, its name is 2 Degrees from Disaster. It is a very important conversation that we need to have. It is now an outdated topic. I'll let that cliffhanger sit there for a minute. The issue in front of us is pretty profound, and I want to remind everybody why we're here. As the Earth's temperature rises, so do global hunger rates. Today, 1 in 10 people worldwide face severe hunger, and our warming climate is putting millions more at risk every day. Ironically, some, including myself, say criminally, communities that contribute the least to the climate crisis are the ones who are most affected. Extreme weather is threatening our food system, driving hunger, and pushing at-risk communities closer to the breaking point. There is a solution. Together, the World Food Program USA is working with the United Nations World Food Program, along with private partners, one of whom is represented here on our stage today, to implement innovative climate solutions to enhance food systems and to build food security. And so we have a prescriptive call to action here to solve the crisis that we're in. And I'm joined by 3 incredible panelists. Alex Diaz from Google, Gernot Laganda, who's the World Food Program's Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Specialist, and my friend Elizabeth Naya Mayaro, the World Food Program Special Advisor. Alex, why don't you and each of you take a moment and tell people specifically what your job entails and what your focus is.
Thank you, Andrew. Hey, everyone. My name is Alex Diaz. I work at google.org, which is Google's philanthropy. And on that team, I oversee several portfolios, chiefly our AI for Good portfolio, where we really look to empower nonprofits, both with our funding, but also with our people, to develop, deploy, and scale innovative AI solutions in partnership with great organizations like the World Food Program to really accelerate the progress that's needed on critical goals. So for example, we have an open call right now for proposals, so anyone in the room that works at a nonprofit or knows of nonprofits or social enterprises that are using AI to make progress against the UN global goals, you got 1 more week to apply. But yeah, I'll be here afterwards and really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm Elizabeth Nyamayaro, and I grew up in a small village in Zimbabwe. So when I was 8 years old, a severe drought devastated my small village, and suddenly we went from having an abundance of food, because we're an agro community. We grew our crops and had plenty to eat, and sadly, the drought came, and these were the early signs of climate change. We just didn't know that there was a thing called climate change. And I remember one day, we'd gone for 3 days without eating, and I literally collapsed on the ground, and I thought I was dying. And thankfully, the United Nations found me. They gave me a bowl of porridge and saved my life. And when I found out that there was this thing called the United Nations at that young age, I remember thinking, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to do this work so that maybe I can save the lives of others in a similar way my life had been saved. And so right now, it's such an honor. That dream came true. I've been with the UN for 2 decades, and in my current role, I'm special advisor for the World Food Program, which is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. And my job is to raise awareness of this issue and make it real and make people realize that this is not an abstract concept. Climate change is here, it's now, it's impacting communities around the world.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming, and also thanks for the invite. My name is Gernot Laganda. I'm the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction at the UN World Food Program. And yeah, together with a lot of talented people, I'm working on the analysis of climate-related risks. What does climate change mean to food systems around the world? What does it mean to local communities? What does it mean to governments? And then on solutions to manage these climate risks so that lives can be protected before they need saving. So this is basically a prevention agenda within the world's largest humanitarian outfit.
Gernot, I want to stay with you for a second here. we submitted for this panel 6 months ago and came up with a fantastic and factual name for our panel, 2 Degrees from Disaster. That's no longer accurate, is it?
Thank you, Andrew, for starting this panel on a very subversive note. I think this is a good idea. Actually, 2 degrees, I remember, when I was a young climate advisor working in Asia Pacific, it was 2007, and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change and Al Gore had just received the Nobel Peace Prize. At that time, 2 degrees was floating around as this dangerous threshold that we should not be crossing, right? 2020, World Food Program receives the Nobel Peace Prize. We were about 0.4 degrees warmer than at that point in time. So we had moved from 0.7 degrees Celsius, sorry, we're counting these degrees in centigrade, but we had moved from 0.7 to 1.1 degrees. Now we're at 1.2 in 2023. So the thresholds that are enshrined in these international agreements, 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement, we're gonna blow past this in the next decade. And the 2 degrees threshold is very realistically not like we have thought in 2007, the end of the century. We're looking at 2040, 2050. And let's not forget, if somebody walks out here thinking that we have still 2 degrees until there is a disaster, I think we would not be doing our job, because every 1/10 of a degree matters. It's a little bit like when you're running a fever. There's a big difference between having 37 and 40 degrees, and every 1/10 of a degree matters. And when we look at other places around the world, many countries in Africa who are in places where you already have a lot of heat waves, a lot of drought, when you look at the hydrometeorological records, they are already living in a 2 to 3 degrees warmer average temperature, because 2 degrees is a global average, and the countries in which we work, the countries where food insecurity is the highest, they're already on average 2 to 3 degrees warmer. So in a global society, we are in a climate emergency, and we are live in the face of clear and present danger, especially for the most vulnerable people.
I want to stick with this intersection of climate crisis and global hunger, and sort of explore with you guys that the ways in which climate warming and extreme weather events are driving an ecosystem of problems, right? Hunger, loss of livelihood, crops, et cetera, and you all approach this from a different way. Elizabeth, can you illuminate for us the issues around communities contributing the least to climate change that are in fact those being impacted the most? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that's really the sad reality. As you pointed out, we know that the biggest contributor to climate change are people in the global north, and the people that are suffering the most are people in the global south. And I like to not dwell too much on the problem, because I think that the key thing is to raise that awareness that our own individual actions, which we may not realize, right? Sometimes this issue is seen as an us versus them. This is happening for those African communities, and we feel so detached to the issue. And when WFP is making a call for support, there's donor fatigue, and people don't realize that it isn't charity anymore. Our world has become so interconnected. We saw this in the pandemic. We've seen this now with climate change, which has now become one of the biggest drivers towards global hunger. It was conflict, was the leading cause of hunger. But climate change is also migration. We are seeing young Africans just escape the safety of their own homes on the continent and die at sea trying to come to Europe for better opportunities. And so my call today, and I know we're just at the beginning, but I always like to give people a way for them to connect with the issue, is that we have a role to play in all this. And it is no longer charity to support those who are in need. It's a moral responsibility, because if we're all part of creating the problem, then we have to be part of the solution. So that would be my analysis on the situation. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a very important issue. We have our first climate refugees, over the last 4 or 5 years. We're seeing it now on several different continents. Who's being, Gernot, maybe you can speak to this. who's being affected the most by the climate crisis? You know, the issues that Elizabeth just talked about are specific to certain regions, but I assume it's everyone.
Yeah, but of course, you know, when you look into what makes a disaster, there's always two ingredients. There's always a damaging event of some kind, a hazard, and these hazards are now becoming supercharged. They're more frequent, they're more intense. We have heat waves to an extent we have never seen them before. Right now, in the Horn of Africa, there are 5 successive failed rainfall seasons, also unprecedented. In Pakistan, there have been these really deadly sequences of a never before known heat wave followed by a monsoon rains on steroids causing $30 billion of damage. So there is now, on the one side, that hazard picture changes, becomes more uncertain, more extreme, many more nasty surprises for people, especially the ones that are growing food, that are dependent on climate-sensitive resources. But then the second ingredient is people's vulnerability. So depending on, you know, do they have financial capital? Do they have access to know-how, access to information, to weather forecasts, access to technology? So these two things combine, and if then that hazardous event matches or comes into contact with people that have already a very high degree of vulnerability, then you have a disaster. And that's actually then in different countries, in different contexts, especially in the context where food insecurity is highest, mostly people who are in these food value chains, who are growing food, who are transporting food, who are dependent on these value chains to operate, and then, you know, they can break down very, very easily.
Yeah, and for those who think it's not happening in their own backyard, I can tell you from personal experience, it's happening in my home state of Minnesota right now as well, with accelerated rainfalls at a time of year where it's very hard and intense, that's destroying crops, lack of soft rain at the beginning of the season for the first time historically in 150 years of record keeping, and we're losing increasingly greater pieces of our apple crop every single year for the last 7 years. It's happening in everyone's own backyard. Alex, I have to ask, you know, people think of Google as a giant tech monolith, right? But the company that you work for actually believes in getting heavily invested in solutions here. Can you talk about Google.org's role in helping to solve this problem?
Yeah, happy to. I think it really starts with our approach. I don't think anyone on my team specifically thinks that they have the answers. I think it's folks like Elizabeth and Gernot that do. So when we're embarking on new projects and trying to say, hey, we want to put our voice, our capital, our people behind the most important problems of our day, who can we start to get smart on this, on the problems, get smart on the potential approaches, convene the local community players that need to be at the table when these solutions are being developed, because that's table stakes. We are corporate citizens. We live in this world. We have our employees and our users are all over the world, and we have a vested interest in making sure that we can be contributing to a better tomorrow. So when we started to embark upon, you know, and I started to build out our portfolio on anticipatory action, which is a jargon term for using data analytics to better anticipate and then better respond in that early window. When you know a disaster is coming, start to put in plans well in advance of a disaster so that when you have that early warning system, you say, hey, a flood is coming, a hurricane is coming, what can you do to make sure that you're protecting the most vulnerable? What actions can you take? Can you give cash to these communities to make sure that when they do receive that alert, and that's one problem. Many communities around the world do not receive those alerts, and that's one project that we're working on. But if they do receive the alert and they understand that alert, but if they don't have the resources to protect their lives or their livelihoods, that's a big problem. And there's a role that cash can play, there's a role a lot of interventions can play to really mitigate, you know, what would be a predictable crisis from being a disaster and a catastrophe. And we are working really, really hard to try and figure out what partners, what players are really on the bleeding edge of this issue, and top of the list was World Food Program. So we embarked on this collaboration a couple of years ago to see how can we work together with our skill sets, with our assets, and my call to action for any private sector partners in the room is you have assets that you can deploy that are really important and really helpful. For us, it's our technical talent. So we say, hey, we have AI engineers, we have data scientists, we have product managers. How can we come alongside the work that you are already doing on the front lines, on the programmatic side, to accelerate that work, to cut the time frame from 2 years to deployment to 6 months, because we have a team that's helping you do that. And we try to do that across a multitude of issues. But front and center for me right now in this portfolio is this collaboration on anticipatory action.
Andrew, can I just go back to your question, who's being impacted the most? You know what I'm going to say? Women and girls.
Yep.
Because we know that in countries that are experiencing conflict and hunger, women and girls tend to eat least and last. They save their families, and then they eat last. And we also know that the majority of smallholder farmers are women. And so if we were just even to think about how do we turn that into an opportunity for the world, women don't have the same access to resources, to farming equipment, and we know through our work that if we just empower women with the same resources, we can actually increase agricultural yields by 20 to 30%. And I want to tell you very quickly a story that illustrates this. A friend of mine works for an international organization that does feeding, and he went to Kenya to do some feeding in a community. And in comes in this woman who had a very frail-looking young girl, and she was really malnourished. They obviously had the standard amount of rations that each family is supposed to get. And my friend decided that he was going to give this woman more than what was being allocated. So he made a promise to her and said, listen, every time when you come in every week, I'm going to give you extra so that you can take care of her. This happens for a few months. One day the woman comes, she's not with the girl, and she's crying. And my friend said, what happened? And she said, my daughter passed away. And it didn't make any sense. He said, but I've been giving you food all this time. And the woman said, I had to make a choice. I have, other children, and I have a husband, and I decided I can either save my husband so that maybe my other kids can survive, or if I give the food to the young girl, then my husband might not actually survive. So she made a decision to save the husband and sacrifice the life of her daughter. And that's horrific when you think about it. So women and girls, and we are doing a lot more work on that as well.
But before we move into solutions, and I think we've set the table for the problem, I'm hoping that we have our video ready and sound too. I love it. I wanted to play this at the beginning, but we were having a couple of tech issues, and I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to download and solve them. So I'd like you to take a look at a small video, and then we'll continue with some questions for our panelists.
Extreme weather is driving hunger around the world. Climate-related disasters are no longer a surprise. Advances in science, technology, and humanitarian coordination means they are now much easier to predict. WFP uses weather forecasts to anticipate, mitigate, and prevent the impact of climate emergencies on vulnerable communities. By acting before a crisis unfolds, we can stop it in its tracks.
We're going to leave that up, so if you want to take a screenshot of the code there and learn more about the work that's being done, I would encourage you to do that. Mitigation is obviously solution one. I mean, that's sort of the first step, right? But Gernot, from the humanitarian perspective, is there an actual solution? Is there something beyond mitigation? Can we solve this problem? How do we more tactically address the climate impact on our hunger problem?
Yeah. So, as you've said, Andrew, I mean, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is basically the baseline need we have. If we do not, we cannot basically prevent a runaway humanitarian emergency on a global scale. But then, everything that kind of gives me hope whenever we travel to places where that hunger emergency is so visceral and so visible is we have all the technology we need in order to address this and in order to get ahead of this. But like so often, we are working with institutional patterns and institutional processes that have grown over decades and that are very reactive, right? So also in the humanitarian system, basically the go-to solution is risk absorption. Something happens, then we go out, we see how big is the damage, then we try to raise financing, which sometimes comes and other times doesn't, especially in certain countries that are widely forgotten. And then we go out and provide whatever we can with the financing we receive. And this is then leading to situations like you have explained, Elizabeth, where then choices have nobody should be able to make choices about who lives and who doesn't, but it's the reality right now that this happens all over the world. So the alternative is we work on programs that have a much, much stronger preventive capability. And this is what Alex explained. I mean, climate is a difficult and complex issue, but contrary to conflict, contrary to things like COVID or the war in Ukraine, which nobody saw coming, climate, we can predict. I mean, we know whether we will have an El Nino in 3 to 4 months or not. We know, how heat waves roll out, or floods, or storms. So the idea here is that we combine a number of elements in our programs, and you could probably summarize this with restore the natural ecosystems that are the physical and landscape-based protection for people, anticipate, provide people with access to early warning systems, weather forecasts, climate information, and then protect. That means financial protection, either through a publicly run social protection system, a climate risk insurance program, or some prepositioned financing that you put aside so that when one of these early warning triggers fires, you immediately have financing that you do not need to raise beforehand, and you already transfer that funding to people.
Okay, I mean, we're putting a giant pin in that, and now, Elizabeth, how does that translate into what's happening on the ground, let's say, for example, with smallholder farmers?
Yes. So actually, just to quickly piggyback on what Geno said, I think to personalize it for all of you here, he mentioned that one of the biggest driver is greenhouse gas emission. Actually, food waste is the third largest contributor towards climate change. A third of the food that we produce is wasted, right? And it happens at production, but most importantly, it's happening in our kitchen. And we know that communities in the developed world who have access, who have more, are throwing food away that ends up in the landfill, and that's creating more greenhouse gas emission. So I think it's not so obvious sometimes when people go, why does it matter if I throw away a piece of chicken? It does matter a great deal. So I think that's one way as well that you can think about your own role in trying to address climate change. But as you said, Andrew, it is quite devastating, how that impacts communities. We have communities that have been, I traveled to Honduras, and I went to the Lenca community, one of the, the original people who have lived their entire lives just sustainably through agriculture, and now they have nothing left. And so we have been supporting them with alternative means for them to make a living, because I think people often forget too that it's not just about them being able to feed themselves. A lot of their crops is also how they, live lives with dignity. They need money, so it's a livelihood. They need money to sell that crop, to be able to send their children to school, to buy the food that they don't grow themselves. And now, in Honduras, one of the things that we are now supporting them is with fish farming, giving them alternative means, and I know you're very passionate about that. So yeah, so this is real, and it's disrupting culture, it's disrupting people's livelihoods, and we all have a role to play in this.
So just to sort of underscore it and connect the dots here, if we can anticipate months ahead of time a catastrophic weather event, we can start to take someone, a corn farmer in Central America, for instance, and get him in to above ground fish farming or pond farming, so that well in advance of this happening, that income stream in that family, that community, that village ceases to be a crisis point during that anticipated weather event, and therefore attention and monies can go to other communities that might need it because they're more impacted by that catastrophic weather event that we couldn't get to in time. Because we can't, the struggle is saving every starfish on the beach. right? I mean, eventually, I hope so, and we're going to talk more about money and public-private partnerships as being the solution in a second, but that's basically one by one, we can save villages and communities by saving families.
Exactly, and that means also a core part of our work is teaching them new farming techniques, letting them know what crops to plant. We're also providing them with drought-resistant crops. So it's really
like kerns and some of the other things people are reading about.
That's it, and it actually it's much cheaper for us at the end of the day to do anticipatory planning than to kind of come in when there's a disaster, because that's much more difficult to manage.
And then they cease to be refugees, and there ceases to be conflict, because I have to assume historically, I know it, when you have that kind of conflict, other conflicts grow there. That's where we see wars, that's where we see factionalism, that's where we see people flooding into cities and crime rates going up, and that's sort of now a new quantifiable piece of this climate crisis, right? So Alex, you talked before about Google providing expertise and working with the World Food Program on this anticipatory action programming. You're also giving grants, right? I mean, so it comes down to money too, right?
That's right.
And
Yep.
you have a big one coming up that I know you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, we have a long-standing relationship with World Food Program that spans years, even before I was on the team, and it's grown over the years, especially as the climate crisis has grown, and focusing on where we can be uniquely differential, where we can be the most helpful. So we did issue a $3 million grant to the World Food Program last year to start in trying to build the weather forecasting capabilities in East Africa, starting in Kenya. We've worked in Indonesia to support their CLEAR and PRISM Plus program to, again, try and equip the right decision makers with the info that they need to understand what is happening, that can then drive actual policy action, some of the mitigative actions that are needed. You can move your livestock uphill so it's not going to be impacted by the flood that's coming, and you can prevent some of the negative coping mechanisms that happen, because people then have to take out a loan to try and cover up the assets that they've lost. And one really awesome collaboration that we've had with the World Food Program is actually with a research team at Google called Sky, that really worked to try and improve the ability to understand when a disaster happens, where have the impacts happened. So one limiting factor that we heard from the organization was we don't know where to channel our aid. And what Sky did was a really simple AI system where you feed it a before and after satellite image, and then you train it to try and detect which buildings have been damaged. So when a disaster happens, you have some latent understanding of where the socioeconomic vulnerability, where the pockets of poor people in certain areas, but then you can easily overlay that with a map that says, here are also the places that have been damaged by a hurricane, and then that accelerates the ability to get aid out into the communities that need it in the matter of days as opposed to weeks or months. And it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to get 100% recall, but can you get a quick and dirty, 70%, 80% coverage where I'm going to target my aid, and I know there's a strong possibility that there's a pocket of folks that are socioeconomically vulnerable that have been damaged, and let's go help them. And then we focus our other boots on the ground to figure out the folks that we might have missed, because those resources aren't perfect. But those are the types of projects. We have that technology, we have that capability, and sometimes we need money and willpower to really get this out and operational in the field.
So you began talking a half hour ago, and you laid out a challenge to other potential corporate partners that may be out there in the audience. Google is giving expertise, human beings with expertise. You mentioned several different categories of that. You're also giving dollars, right? So Google sees as a corporation incredible value in these types of partnerships. To someone out there who's considering going back to their board or their executive committee or their C-suite and saying, hey, we have to get involved too. What would you say to them are the benefits for Google in doing this?
I mean, I think we're in a really unique moment in time where we're grappling with the social contract that we as citizens have with corporations, with companies. What is the role of a company in our society? And I think it's beyond just profit maximization, right? Of course, that is part of a corporation, right? That is one element of consideration, but there's so much more. What value are we providing to society? How are we being helpful? How are we leveraging? Because not only is that important from a brand perspective, our employees care. Our employees, that's what motivates them. That gets them their morale up. It's like, I feel that I am day in and day out coming into work, and I feel like I'm making a difference in the world. And I think if you make that case, you should be successful.
Scan that code. Bring that to your workplace. Very quickly before we move on to I have another section of questions about various calls to action. But Garna, hearing Elizabeth and Alex talk, could you briefly summarize how WFP's climate programs are making a difference and impact based on this amount of wisdom and tech and money and the diversity of programs that are being deployed globally?
Yeah, certainly. Oh, sorry, certainly.
Yeah.
I would say that the humanitarian sector a decade or two ago looked very different than the humanitarian sector today. I mean, we wouldn't have been in places like this. We wouldn't have had these conversations. And it's really, I mean, maybe 20 years ago we were in think tank mode. No, what does climate change mean? The 2 degrees, when is this gonna hit us? Now I don't think we need to be in think tank mode. We need to be in think and do tank mode. No, mm-hmm. So it's really an issue that requires radical collective ownership by everybody. I mean, we are part of the UN. The UN has a climate change negotiations process. This is COP28, Conference of Parties 28 this year. You look at the emissions curve, it keeps climbing and climbing and climbing, and the hunger problem keeps becoming worse and worse. But then the United Nations are not only that one process. You know, there is a whole range of a community of practice, I would call it, of people from different backgrounds, you know, from media, from tech, humanitarian development, climate action, that are working together, using some of these fora that they meet in regularly to address some of these solutions. And what we have just been touching upon is very important, because we know by now that we are driving into a wall. We know that. Now, it's about fastening seatbelts and not haggling as to who is going to sit in which place in the car, right? And so this is fastening seatbelt is exactly what we're trying to do, especially for those people that are at the front lines of the issue, because it's not going to be probably Europe or the US that is going to be hit hardest with the first hunger waves. No, it's going to be people who are already in very high stages of vulnerability, people who are dependent on farming, people who are in climate risk hotspots, even in places in Africa where you think, okay, there are many rice farmers. There are many migrant laborers, you know, that are not even having a little plot in which they can farm, but they are so dependent on that value chain. These are the folks that we need to reach first, because as a global community, we're only as resilient as our most vulnerable members. This is something we also saw in COVID, no? Yeah. Like it hit the older people, the people with pre-existing health conditions, that paralyzed the entire health system. It's similar with climate change.
And that resilience is actually decreasing because of the increase in climate change. I mean, that to me is the vulnerable irony of all of this that has to be addressed. I want to start to turn towards calls to action. As consumers, business leaders, and policymakers, I want to know from each of you what we all can do to address this global hunger and climate crisis. So you each get a magic wand, right? And I'm guessing that you're all going to have a different hope or wish that magic wand is going to fulfill. But what would you like to see happen and change? And I'm not... You don't get to say the climate crisis goes away, right? This is about solutions that we can employ. I know. Solutions that we can employ, the big royal we, to actually make a difference. Alex, I'll start with you.
I wish I had several. I wish I had like the
Yeah.
3 wishes. I mean, one is...
You can get more than one if you can say it quickly.
Say it quickly? Okay. Well, I threw out a couple already. It's like, if you work in the private sector, like, please find ways to support. Like, there's so much value that you can provide if you're working in collaboration with and learning from the organizations on the front lines. And I also say collaborate with each other. I think there's so much duplication that often happens in these spaces. When instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, if we came together and say, hey, there's a common problem, let's work on a shared solution. So please reach out. We love to collaborate.
Elizabeth?
Mine is a reminder that none of us are ever too small to make a difference. I think we've heard a lot about what you can do if you're a business, but as an individual, you have to do your part as well. And there's often a disconnect. People actually do believe, even the people that believe in climate change aren't actually taking the next step to try and mitigate climate change. And people, it can feel quite overwhelming, but there's very simple ways. Educate yourself on the issue. Use the social media, especially if you're a young person. We actually did a survey last year, by the way, Andrew, here in the US. And it was, to our surprise, lots of young people didn't really believe that there is climate change. And yet it is real. So I want to just invite you to, don't waste food in your kitchen. Use the social media as a force for good. And I'll share one quick African proverb, which is my favorite proverb. And it says, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending a night in a room with a mosquito. I think it's, if you've ever been in a room, you can't imagine how such a small thing can cause such havoc. And I think you are much bigger than a mosquito. And if a once malnourished young girl from Africa can sit here in front of you, being part of the solution, I think we all too can be part of the solution.
Fair enough.
No, as consumers, and I don't think anyone here who came to listen to a panel like this does not understand the relationship between the food that you eat and the weather outside the window, right? So there is a connection. So on the greenhouse gas emissions side, the ask for me would be, establish that awareness, create that awareness, take that awareness with you to your families, your friends, your communities. But then there is, on the professional side, I think my ask would be try to understand how you connect to that topic of protection, predict and protect, because that for us is the most important challenge. We don't have a lot of time. I mean, in order to build these systems for prediction and protection for the most vulnerable, we have maybe 5-10 years, and after that it's going to be a runaway trend. So that fragmentation that exists in our professional world, let's reduce it together, and let's try to see whether, when you're working on particular projects that fit in that space that you have heard about in this panel today, when you work on this, please, let's have a conversation and see whether we can build something that's a little bit more integrated.
I'm going to do what is the one thing any moderator should never do, which is answer his own question. But I feel somewhat enabled to, because with another one of my hats, I'm the WFP's global ambassador for waste, and Elizabeth, who's one of my gurus, has mentioned waste now 3 times. So I don't want to get yelled at when I leave about not giving some tactical information that you can do in your own homes. In the 1970s, we doubled the size of the average American refrigerator so you could shop every 7 to 10 days, and waste has gone through the roof since that time. They are related. Shrink the size of your fridge. I'm not asking you to go out and spend money and replace it. Take a shelf out, take a drawer out. 1 shelf, 1 drawer. You'll buy less. You won't have room for it, right? Shop more often. The trade-off, yes, is you might be driving your car once, right? But you're going by a market. You're going to retrain yourself to not take an extra trip that you wouldn't ordinarily do. You're just going to stop on the way home once more during the week. It's very, very doable. As important, if you own a restaurant, a business, if you're a member of a big corporation that has food service in the building, in your own homes, keep a waste journal. It's the simplest thing in the world. We did it in our house for 2 weeks. Turned out we were throwing out the same stuff all the time, right? So now we knew what we could actually scale back, with. If we do that, your chicken leg analogy becomes very, very, very real. And the third thing, and I would encourage everyone to do this, is spread awareness. Every single person in here has a network of friends and family on email and in social. Click that barcode, pull a quote that meant something to you from a panelist and send it to everyone that you know. Because this truly is an existential problem that it is going to take all of us to solve, all of us. So this is not something that we have to rely on companies like Google to write big checks. We can also take small actions along with, in partnership, the grander gestures and change the world that we live in. Elizabeth, the call to actions that we're all talking about can directly affect some of the places that you visit regularly. And I was wondering if you could give people, because I think it's very valuable, an example of a solution that has worked that you have seen, so that people out here understand that the vital work that's being done by the organizations represented here and others around the world really are worth investing in.
Yeah, I want to share an example from Egypt. So the last COP was in Egypt, and Geno and I were able to participate. But a few months prior to COP, I was able to actually go visit communities. And I ended up in a community in Aswan in Upper Egypt. And what I saw, Andrew, was just absolutely remarkable. And again, it goes back to women. So COVID happened, and in this particular community, traditionally women don't leave the house. And all the farming is actually done by men, which is quite unusual. Like a country like Zambia, where we also have projects where 80% of the smallholder farmers are women, but in this particular region, the women aren't allowed in the field. So COVID happened, and suddenly the men couldn't go outside, and they had nothing to feed their families with or send the kids to school with. And suddenly the women realized that they could be part of a solution. So a big part of our work at WFP is around resilience. It's, we are known for kind of coming in during a crisis and feeding communities, but really the big bulk of our work is trying to figure out a sustainable way for communities to be able to uplift themselves. So the women in this community decided that they wanted to start something, and so they approached WFP, and we started working with them on in-kind loans. So they'd come up with an idea that they wanted to raise chickens and ducks and goats. Again, that wouldn't allow them to work from home, and actually sell those goats so that they could make money. And it was remarkable because they became so successful that they started using those in-kind loans, which are provided by WFP, to start their own businesses. And now they are doing sewing and knitting businesses. They're actually selling some of those produce in the capital city. But what was remarkable is that post-COVID, the men actually realized that the women could make a contribution. And so suddenly the women are allowed out of the household. It completely changed an entire culture. And women are running businesses, because also what happened is that most of the men were depressed. They were suicidal because they couldn't take care of their own families. And so that's why I think we have been advocating for more funds towards resilience projects, and this is really our wheelhouse at WFP.
Co-creation, collaboration, and contributions of all kinds are the solution. Yeah. We've talked internally for years about the big C words that have been the cause of the problem, right? Yeah. On the hunger side, specifically the food chain system, climate, conflict, COVID, right? We now have a whole new set of C's to sort of lean into, and I think that's a really great place to invite people to line up for questions. I have about 150 more for these panelists, and we could talk about this all day long, but I think encouraging you, please come on up, to grab a microphone and address your question however you would like it, and I would ask that, don't be afraid to ask a question. There is no such thing as a bad question. A conversation is really, really valuable. We're recording this. It provides the spark that maybe someone else, your words could inspire thousands. So Please.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was a really, really great panel. I'm an advertising creative, a copywriter. I've helped brands tell stories for many years. I'm also really conscious that I have contributed to the problem of overconsumption and pushed brands and behaviors which are hugely unsustainable as well. So I'm having a little bit of a road to Damascus moment over the last couple of years. I just wanted to ask specifically about advertising and communications. How, to the whole panel really, how do you want the advertising industry and people with the skills that I've got to best help? And the second thing is more about tone. What tone do you want us to adopt? Because so much of what we're hearing is so bleak and shocking and potentially disempowering. So yeah, two parts to that question really. How do you think the advertising industry could help, and what tone would you like us to take?
Who wants to tackle that?
Maybe we can start. We just had before that panel started, exactly that conversation. So thanks for that question. I think it's incredibly important. I mean, in WFP, we're a humanitarian agency, so we have decades of experience talking about the problem and in order to raise the funds to meet that gap between the people who need support and the financing we have available. So there is an entrenched pressure point narrative bias. And when it comes to climate change, it's completely counterproductive. So if I had another, with that magic wand, another wish, I would hope that we can communicate about the issue in a very solutions-focused way. Cartoons have been great, but many cartoons focus on, again, the problem, that the world is burning and so forth. We need the same engaging communication about the solutions as we have had it about the problem a decade ago. And it's really difficult. It's also, I know, prevention, anticipation. Communicating this is so much more difficult than on the humanitarian aid side, which is very straightforward. You have an airdrop, there's food falling from the sky, or there are trucks rolling and people helping each other, which is very, I think, intuitive. But for prevention, for resilience building, it's much more difficult. So I think that nobody has the answer, but it needs to be solutions focused. I think we need to put that collective creativity to work in order to find a new way of communicating climate change. And I'm gonna, if you give me your card, I'm gonna send you an article in Nature that basically has analyzed exactly that question, in how far people respond positively or negatively to problem or solutions narratives on climate change. So
has to be solutions. Has to be solutions.
Yeah. No, and first of all, we actually can't do this work without you. You had yesterday, for those who attended the opening session, and it's something that I firmly believe in, is that stories create empathy and compassion. We need to be able to humanize the stories of those that are impacted so that we can see the humanity in them. Because it's difficult for you to care about something that you see as the other, right? And storytelling is key. As Geno said, it's not really usually our wheelhouse because we are trying to make sure there's an emergency, but we actually need storytellers. And in fact, yesterday I made a call on my own social, which is that for anyone here who wants to become an innovation mentor for WFP staff, we are creating this community. Whether you have knowledge on AI or big data or tech, we actually want you and we need you, and so storytelling is part of that. So please get in touch with Geno.
Two quick things to add. Fully agree with everything that Gernot and Elizabeth have said. Leverage your cultural capital, right? Your microphone, the reach that you have is incredible. Elizabeth was mentioning a study that earlier about the youth no longer thinking that climate change is not a problem. And I think there's probably a correlation between a lot of the doom and gloom narrative and this feeling of helplessness. So find ways to reach especially the younger generations. But the last thing I said, to Gernot's point on, the human psychology is really, really difficult and gets in the way of thinking about things in advance. Preparation, anticipation is just not what we're hardwired towards. So how do you make that tangible so that people can internalize the value of anticipating and acting early before it's too late?
Those are literally the most important pillars. And I would add I would add one thing, because I get this question all the time, especially more so over the last 3 or 4 years than the previous 7. People ask, well, we're trying to change global behavior patterns of individuals, of corporations. There's a greed element here that is, some people feel is irreparable, right? Because of money driving so many decisions. And what I would say from an advertising point of view and a marketing and branding point of view, every behavioral scientist on planet Earth will tell you that trustworthiness drives behavioral change from a marketing, branding, advertising perspective. Who is telling you the facts and the figures is what's important. That's why storytelling is so important, because I can tell you all the opinions in the world, but I'm going to Zambia for the first 10 days, 9 days of April, to highlight the stories of the solutions that are on the ground there, and I'm going to be talking to the people who are living there. I'm not going to be talking to a scientist or someone who put the program in. I'm going to be talking to the people who are living it in the villages there, in those solutions. And my hope is that my trustworthiness score on that storytelling scale, which has been quantified because of what I do with my day job, has a positive impact. So whatever you're choosing, that's why it's so important in your networks, because your friends believe you. At least I'm assuming so, right? All you have to do is tell them that this is something that moved you. Trustworthiness drives behavior. Trustworthiness drives behavior. Next question.
Hi, my name's Sam. I work for an organization called Heifer International. We're a Heifer. Do a lot of work with that WFP. My question is for Alex. When you're looking to partner with a nonprofit organization, beyond brand alignment and the need, what are some of the criteria that you use to evaluate a potential nonprofit partner?
It's a great question, and actually, my wife's grandmother, we call her Honey. Every year she does a annual fundraiser, just like giving little trinkets, and our family bidding on it. And the charity of choice last year was Heifer. Yeah. What couple things that we look at, obviously since we're Google, is like the role that technology and innovation can play. That's where we think we can be uniquely helpful. So oftentimes we are looking for organizations, and listen, there's a way more organizations that I'd love to support that we cannot work. We just have limited resources. So we really think through where can we be really helpful, especially with our capital, but more importantly also with our people. So that's one critical element that we look for, is like, what is the technical nature of the problem that this organization is trying to solve, and is the skill sets and the programs that they need something that we could potentially provide and come alongside.
And thank you so much for this conversation. I resonate a lot with the first question. I work in marketing for a company that sells cars, so I feel very guilty multiple times questioning my career. I try to make conscious decisions. I don't waste food, but I still think that looking at an individual level, there's very little we can do. Like, if I don't waste food, if we all stop wasting food, eating meat, driving cars, it's not going to change much. I had to hop on 2 planes to get here today. So my question is, it's like, is it possible to reverse this in a globalized world where we rely, like, probably all my clothes come from overseas, to the materials, etc. Like, is it possible to reverse it, or now it's just like mitigating whatever we can?
Yes, it's possible. This is when, I mean, we in WFP, when you're in this humanitarian work, you see really the sharp end of the issue. And it's, if this doesn't really throw you, I mean, when you open your email in the morning, or you get the latest operational updates, floods in Yemen and droughts and heat waves and conflict, and it all works into this itself into this toxic mix. Every time I do that, I think we know how to address it. It's the good thing I see is, we have the technology. That means we don't need to research 20 or 30 years until we know how to eat better, or transport ourselves in a green way, or protect vulnerable people. So it's about institutional processes, institutional incentives, getting that institutional piece right. And there, everybody can, I mean, starting from who you vote for, from who you talk to about which issues. So this goes to the second thing that always gives me hope, which is we're not alone in this. There's a whole huge number of people who sees the interconnectedness of it all. And even if you are in a company that manufactures cars, if you understand the context, what it means, how the whole greenhouse gas emission story works, how it plays itself out, which innovations exist in order to then reduce the impact, you can find a little piece of the puzzle that you can push from within this sector. I think this is super important. We cannot have a polarized society where on the one side there are people who think green and work green, and then others who do not. I think we need to all be in the same boat, and we all need to put our little spheres of influence together in order to achieve a bigger progress. But at the bottom of my heart, I think we can come to grips with this issue. We must, and we will.
Yeah, but it's not surprising, though, that you feel this certain kind of despair. I think most of us feel it, but at the same time, I concretely believe, because I wanted to emphasize this point, believe that if all of us take small individual action, those individual actions will culminate into big change. But we also know, as you're saying, that real change happens when two things happen at the same time, when the bottom up and the top down move at the same time. So you've heard a lot about what we're doing at the community level, but a big part of our work as well, not just WFP, but the United Nations, is working with companies, with policymakers, with governments, with the fossil fuel companies, because they have to do their part as well, so that, really we kind of have this transformation happening at the same time. But if you do want some papers as well, my colleague Tula, who is sitting here, they did the survey. We are trying to figure out a way now that we can take this survey around climate change to create some kind of viral call to action to govern as young people. So that could be a good connection for you to do something with purpose.
I think, Churchill said it best, right? Never, 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 ever, ever, never, never give up. Yeah. I believe in the power of human beings to solve this problem. I truly, truly do. And like my colleague said, I've been out there at the sharp end of the problem, and I've also seen the solutions. I'm working on a documentary called Hope in the Water right now that we're screening tomorrow, shameless plug. But the point of it is that I've seen the solutions in the water. I've seen the solutions in the water. I've seen the solutions on the ground. So it's exposing people to those ideas so they say, oh, this works. So then people will start advocating for people in Africa, right? We do have a problem in this country of thinking that somehow this isn't going to happen to us, but it's happening in every state in America, right? So we have to understand that every human being has the same amount of value, and that positivity, that solutions organized thinking is what's going to save us. But don't despair, and then check yourself and remember that there is a solution. Sir.
Hello, my name is Chris, and I heard you guys talking about crop fragility to the changing climate map. And I started recognizing this about 10 years ago, just knowing what has happened in the wheat fields. Are you familiar with anybody else working on how to produce a different type of agriculture? My solution was to integrate the agriculture into living residents, because you have to protect yourself and the food from a ravaging weather systems. Weather is getting much more radical and is going to increase. So I'm looking for more people that are actually involved with that so I can exchange ideas.
I got one great example. There are, and you can simply Google it, there is a huge movement afoot of people growing an entire ecosystem of food, raising tilapia and shrimp, green vegetables, grains in their own home, insulated with recycled tires, and they're doing it in the high desert of Arizona and New Mexico.
I guess I'm looking for more people who are doing it in apartment complexes.
Well, we have sample programs at an organization that I work with in New York that are doing it in apartment complexes and on roofs, covered and uncovered, to recover. So people are taking these smaller, sort of, I'll just call them homegrown solutions, and then trying to work with people like Google to expand them. Hence that program that Alex was talking about at the beginning, where people with great ideas can apply for this grant making. And our organization in New York has received grants from all kinds of companies. So it is happening, and it is out there, because that is the ultimate anticipatory response, right?
Description for this old style of open fields agriculture where we're taking it out and protecting it, and it's not like a greenhouse or urban agriculture. We recognize that hoping that the climate would be stable enough to allow a crop to occur. I'm also looking for that word or phrase.
Maybe we can take it offline after. There are a few possible talking points I have for you around urban farming, but also diversified and eco-agricultural farming. Yeah.
Thank you all for this. I feel like I'm coming from a very doom and gloom perspective as well, and this has been super helpful and hopeful, but I still look at things like, I think like the US military is like the largest emitter of greenhouse, and that just seems like such a insurmountable problem. So all the solutions you're talking about sound like amazing ways to contribute and help in different ways, but are things being done to address that, or is that just, have we passed that point where it's like the US government is not going to change anytime soon, or are there things I can do in that perspective to try, like, or that you are all doing to try and like change those minds?
Anybody know about DoD activations along this line?
Well, one thing that I know is that militaries all over the world are analyzing climate risks on their operations, and they're considering it as a real threat. If you are in a country where you still have, people who do not believe in climate change being real, but at the same time, there's a lot of, I think, believing in the economy and the military and insurance companies, they have the best data about climate-related risks. This is always when someone doubts, that this is real. I mean, if the U.S. military does studies about climate change, or NATO does it, or every other security military in the world, they're taking it very seriously. The way they also address it is they see the conflict potential of climate change. The fragility that it creates. It's a fire under the kettle. It's not only more extreme and frequent events that then basically interrupt access routes or transport routes. It's also human conflict, tensions, social tensions, displacement, forced displacement creates huge geopolitical risks. And I think that's at least the only connector I have. I know there is a little bit an open door here to discuss about programs that can dampen a little bit that risk, that can manage that risk, and including, investing more in resilience building in countries where people are already very vulnerable and just one step away from falling into that fragility. So there is, I think, also a positive conversation you can have with military.
You do feel there's a path forward. I guess I have like us versus them, like there's bad actors.
The U.S. Department of Defense is the largest consumer of energy on planet Earth, and there's a whole group within there that is analyzing how to change that at the DoD, because they don't want to spend those gas bills. They're trying to spend it on other things, not necessarily things I believe in, but they are going to try to solve that problem. Sadly, I am getting very angry looks from the back of the room. The two people who are behind you, please come on up and talk to us afterwards. I would like to thank our panelists, if we could have a big round of applause for them. Shameless plug. We're going to leave this up here. If you need to come up closer to allow your camera to click on that icon and be able to join us in this noble fight, please do. And please spread the awareness. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day.